Hey, everyone, welcome to Podcast Insider Special Edition. I'm Todd Cochran, your host, and of course, I've got my good friend with me today, Jay Nachlis from Coleman Insights. Jay, how are you?
Doing great, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for folks that don't know you, why don't you give that 411 of information so people get to know you a little bit?
Sure. So I was a radio guy for most of my career. Actually, from the time I was 15 years old is when I first got into radio. Did radio for a couple of decades. I was on the air. I was a program director of radio stations. And then about 7, 8 years ago, I moved to Coleman Insights to the research side of things. And Coleman has been around for 45 plus years as a radio research company. That's how it started, right? So it was originally designed to provide strategic insights for radio stations, and then that was kind of a natural progression right into podcasting. And I became the guy who heads up those initiatives for Coleman. And so I have a lot of podcasting clients, but I still also have a lot of radio clients. So I'm doing research projects for multiple industries, but I still love both.
So, looking back to your radio days, unlike podcasting, you weren't a team of one. You had program director, sales director, marketing director, probably a whole bunch of other titles, salespeople, promotion people. I don't know
Yeah.
what is a normal team back in the day before consolidation. What is a team at a radio station look like?
So you would generally have a general manager of the radio station, which back then, a general manager was responsible for one radio station.
Right.
A program director responsible for one radio station, and that's been the biggest change. And then of course you had air talent that were on every shift,
Right.
including overnights, right? So I guess the first shoe to drop was when voice tracking came along, and that happened in the I was working in Detroit at the time, so I remember it very, very well. It happened in like the early 2000s is when it became really popular to, I mean, if you go way back, you had to, if you wanted to record a show, you had to do it on like reel to reel
Right. Right.
and play it back, right? Or put it on a CD or whatever. And then voice tracking digitally made it so much easier to just record a show wherever you were and then play it back at any given time. And that changed the game because now you had shows that weren't live all the time.
Mm.
Overnights was a shift that generally got cut for that reason because of the number of listeners at that time. And so now, yeah. And then you had a promotions director, like you said, a sales department, and a lot of that stuff through consolidation over the years. You just have program directors that are responsible for more radio stations, general managers that oversee not just stations in their market. Sometimes general managers will oversee regions, right? Big parts of the country. You have VPs of programming that oversee multiple parts of the country or the entire country. And then radio talent are often doing multiple stations too,
Right.
not just in their own cluster of stations locally, but they might be doing shows across the country.
It was funny when I was living in Hawaii. There was only two or three owners of radio stations there, so you'd be on one station, you could go to the other, and you'd hear the same voices doing weather. Across
Right.
five different stations. It was the same thing, just cut. And the reason I asked that is because since I started podcasting in 2004, I was largely a team of one. It was me. That was
Right.
it. And fortunately today I've got someone to help me with pre-production, and on the Blubrry side we have someone that goes and makes us sound good.
Yeah.
But the average podcaster today that's getting started don't have a team. They have to do everything: marketing, research. They have to do sales. If they have to social media, and they have to think about if they're doing interviews, releases for their guest, and all these different things that happen. So we understand that because we do this, and you do too, to an extent. But you launch this product called PodPredictor, and I was like, what is this PodPredictor? And when I read the mission statement of what the product does, I was like, oh boy, I could have used that a few years ago. But and before we get into the details of Pod Creator, I guess what inspired it? I guess tell us about it, but what inspired the creation of Pod Predictor?
I think some of it comes from something you just said, which is where today's podcasters, most of them, live in their creation cycle, right? They have to do everything. They're the host and producer and editor and
Yeah.
digital marketer and all of those types of things. And so I think so it's twofold. One was, how do we come up with something that we can do that every podcaster can access? Because a lot of the work that we do, most of the work that I do, is for larger networks, right? Publishers that are interested in custom research for large scale podcasts or a series of them, right? Whereas something for the more independent podcaster, a lot of that stuff can be out of reach. And when you're talking about reaching real consumers, right, and actually getting data from them, that can be very expensive.
It
So
is.
we tried to come up with Pod Predictor to make it affordable enough that everybody has a shot to get some real insights that help them with that part of the journey. Because like you said, it's hard enough to try and come up with a podcast, then host it, then edit it, then put it out. Pod Predictor, the idea behind it is let's take some of that lifting of the guesswork of the marketing play and understanding, here's some of the, when I'm trying to come up with a concept, when I'm trying to come up with the elevator pitch, we know all of those things are really important with getting people to notice your podcast, but there's so much guesswork that goes into it. So Pod Predictor gives you access to actual podcast consumers to test that concept and test the pitch.
So it's basically, this is a product someone would use before they launch.
Exactly.
Preferably.
It's meant for pre-launch. That's right.
So pre-launch, you've got this idea. I want to do a podcast on XYZ.
Yep.
Here's my goal, or here's the audience I want to reach. And if they have, is that the minimum information they need to work with Pod Predictor, or what's the process? You say you have a questionnaire they have to fill out, or what's the what level of information does the podcaster need to know to work with you?
There's a couple of different ways to do it. So, and I'm going to work with them on that. So they don't, if they want help, for example, if they're at a level where they go, I don't even know what concepts to try, or I don't even know what titles to try. That's something that I can help with as part of that. So at the bare minimum, I mean, let's say you don't even know what category you want to go with.
Oh.
You could do that, right? And with that, we would then make it really broad among all podcast consumers, no matter what category fans they are. And then you can get an idea of what kind of things test among all podcast consumers. Now, the more common usage is a little bit more focused, right? And this goes back to what you said. So you already know you want to do a sports podcast, you want to do news, politics, kids, whatever it is. And so you've identified that. You just don't know exactly which way to go on the title, which way to go on the pitch. And so in that case, we would go find you fans of that category, and you would actually test your concept among people that just have a higher propensity of being into it, and we would test it with them. And then I would be part of you with the process of helping you come up with those titles and pitches.
So you have a concept, you come to you, said, this is a concept for my show. What are the actual deliverables? In other words, you're going to go out and talk to real people about this concept for this show. That could get pretty detailed, I would think. So how, what is the, I guess for better words, what is the type of questions then, or how many questions are you going to ask a potential listener of this show? Does this sound like this is a good idea or not? I don't know. Walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah. The deliverable is, the magic of the deliverable is really, what we call in the research world, we call them crosstabs, right? Or looking at all of the different ways that you're cutting the data. That's what makes it really interesting, because the questions, there's not that many questions. There are additional things that we can test. We can test trailers. We can test show art.
Oh.
But essentially, if you're testing, for example, titles and pitches, what comes back is, first of all, we're looking for passion, right? you're not looking at just an overall score, because when we do research, a lot of times we're pulling out the middle. We want to know whether or not someone loves it or whether or not they really dislike it. And so that's the first thing that I'm looking at is, well, what do people have passion about in these concepts? Is there something that's really resonating from a passion standpoint? Do they really hate this? Do they really love this? And then we cut it a lot of different ways. So we look at it by age, by gender, ethnicity, region of the country, and then we're also looking at it by category fans. So, if you do it among, now let's say you want it among sports fans because it's a sports concept. Well, generally, sports podcast fans aren't just interested in sports podcasts, right? They're going to be interested in other things. So, one of the things is not just what should I be launching, but it's using it as a marketing play. And this goes into what you were talking about, right? If you're creating a marketing plan and it includes, well, what words should I be using? What social media should I be on? That's another thing we're looking at, is which social media platforms are they using? So what's a good place to put it? Are they using video? Are they just using audio? And where can I market this? Let's say, for example, you're testing a comedy podcast and you find that your particular concept is really interesting to people who are also fans of science podcasts, right? And that's a bit of a surprise. So you go, well, maybe I should do some guest spots on science podcasts because this has some appeal there. Those are some different uses from the deliverable.
So ultimately, you're going to evaluate to determine if a podcast concept will resonate with an audience.
Right.
Has there been some that have come back, well, maybe we need to change this a little bit? Or how has your experience been? I would assume, because you've had this pre-discussion with people, you guys have really kind of locked in the concept, hoping that the feedback you're going to get is positive. So, they're doing more planning than most podcasters do. But do you still once in a while get this, we need to tweak this a little bit left or right, or flip it upside down, or, what is that kind of feedback that you get then when something isn't, we're going to look at it both ways, when it's not so great and when it's super good?
Yeah, there are definitely occasions where the one that tests is not the one that was expected to test.
Oh.
Right? Sometimes the lesson comes back that it didn't appeal who you thought it was going to appeal to, right? So you might find that the wheelhouse of it is, 35 to 44-year-old women. And, you just had no idea that it had that much appeal with it. So I think that's the magic of it. And look, research is great it can be great for two reasons. One is it can validate something you already thought. And yeah, I think it's a bit of a misnomer to go, well, doing research to just find out something I already know is a waste of money. Well, not really. Validating something to make sure that you've got the right, track, the right strategy, that's a good thing too. But it's also very often in research, there's always at least one thing that surprises you and goes, no, I didn't expect that. And so I think that's where the real value is.
We worked with you folks a couple of years ago because we were trying to answer some internal questions ourselves. We didn't use PodPredictor, but we did a more normal study. And we kind of had assumptions on some things, and we had really some big surprises on others. So it kind of came back was, the assumptions were pretty close, but here's the little tweak, and here's the little, oh, by the way, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You didn't know this, now you do. That was like incredibly valuable. I'll give you an example. We knew our dashboard was just long in the tooth. We knew it needed to be updated. We were in the process, but we didn't know how bad it really was.
Right.
So, and it kind of, it made us kind of understand that. So for us, that feedback that we got, and matter of fact, even today I get a new hire and say, hey, read this from like 2 years ago. Here's where we are from where we come from. And we use this data that was basically talk to our real customers. They didn't know because it was all anonymous. You didn't say you're doing this on the behalf of Blubrry, but we're able to, get this picture. So I say, this is what we did. This is what was the outcome. And here's where we are now. And, so they can look and see the changes we made based upon that feedback. So I would assume then with PodPredictor, it's the same process. You get the feedback post. Wow, this is going to resonate for, let's say, 25 to 35 female. I have to change. I have to think about the content in just a little bit different way. And if I want to reach an expanded audience, maybe I need to tweak this a little bit. So what are some of the success stories you've seen from this so far?
Yeah, I mean, there was one that we tested recently that, and this is something that I think a lot of times when people are trying to come up with titles, maybe they're trying to be cute,
Cute's
or
not good.
it's something that, right, or it's something that they think, well, yeah, this is something that just, I don't know. It sounds like a good idea to me, or sounds like something would resonate. But when you listen to the title, it doesn't really say what it is,
Yeah.
right? Or it's just something completely off base. And I think so. So some of the successes come from that, which is really because I try to drive the testing to say, well, let's put something in there that might be. You got to think about what's really specific, what's really broad, what's descriptive, what's not descriptive, and thinking about the show notes. We have this thing we talk about Coleman all the time. It's outside thinking, and the difference between inside and outside thinking, right? Inside thinking is when you're too close to something.
Yes.
Right? And when you're too close to something, you don't think like the consumer thinks.
Nope. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
You're very narrow. And look, if you're a podcaster and you're probably a really heavy podcast consumer, also heavier than the average podcast consumer, and you see things in podcasting in a different way, not the way that typical podcast consumer sees it. So when you're going out and creating these things, it's really important sometimes to try to step out and recognize how the average consumer is going to react to your title, to react to your show notes. So you might be writing your show notes for someone like you. You might be writing that title for someone like you, but you got to think about testing something for a broader audience, an audience that is seeing it for the first time, that maybe has no idea who you are, right? So you might be boasting about things in those show notes that are only interesting to a small number of people, for example. So those successes, I think, come from learning, oh, wow, yeah, this was too inside. Yeah, I need to think of this at a different angle, in a different way. And back to what you said about, like, when you start to really understand the target audience better, think about all the ways that can formulate your strategy. It things about the topics that you choose, the tone of your podcast, the way you might present it on video, the social media that you promote it on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes on and on.
It's funny, when we launched our AI product, we were watching usage across the platform, and I had a prediction. This will be used less than this, and this will be used. In other words, I ranked them 1, 2, 3, 4. This will be number 1 use. This will be 2. This will be 3. And that kind of really was how they were using it. But one of the products was like not being used. And I was like, oh my God, we built that for nothing. And one of my team members went to Starbucks one day, the UI UX designer, and on his own, he's like, hey, look at this. and non-podcasters, someone that it had nary a clue, and he said, this is our podcast AI assistant. Oh, that's cool. What is it supposed to do? And he would tell him, and they would like, why is this like that? Why is that like this? How come you have that here? He came back and basically wrote up, and this is just like 3 hours in Starbucks and maybe 10 people looking at this thing. And he said, we're going to change this, 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 and this. And first of all, I was like, why? And I was kind of, and I kind of had to sleep on it. And you know what it really was? I was too close.
Right.
I was way too close. And after I kind of, and I always have this analogy, think like a fifth grader, You got to think about a fifth grader seeing it for the first time. Can the fifth grader understand the purpose and know how to use it? Because fifth graders, in this world, in this tech world, they're pretty smart. And I said, oh, yeah, dummy us. So we made the change. And And it costs us about a month's worth of work. But then coming out of that and then saying, hey, we've updated the UI, all of a sudden now we're seeing the numbers kind of where we thought they were supposed to be. And we really learned something from that. I'm like, go to Starbucks. We're getting ready to change something. Go to Starbucks and show them the AB, let's see what happens. So I think that it's important. We get too close. It's my baby, right?
Right.
Your baby's your baby. And sometimes you got to have the ugly baby talk. So how does that kind of go when you have the ugly baby talk with the client, or is it just kind of evolve? They paid you to do this research, they're getting the facts back, and they're going to go, huh? Do they step back and adjust, or do some people just want to,
dig in?
What do you see on that?
Fortunately, it's rare. I think some of that goes. I mean, look, it's our job in the beginning of any research project to do the right. If we're doing our jobs properly, then we've set expectations properly, and some of that is to say, look, we're going to give you not just the data, we're going to give you actionable insights, strategic recommendations, as to say, if we were in your shoes, here's what we would do. We're not in your shoes, and I can't execute it.
Right.
But I'm going to do my best to tell you, right? And yeah, you can tell me to go to hell and not do any of it if you want to.
Right.
Pay for it. But hopefully, if we're good strategic partners, because that's the other thing, Todd,
that's the key.
It is key because look, I shouldn't take every client, to be honest with you. I mean, I think the relationship between and this is not just research company to client, it's almost any business, right? But we're not what we do is very collaborative. We go through a process of, and you remember when we did a project together, like we spend a lot of time on the front end learning about your product, learning about your competitors, and figuring out the right way to ask the questions and design the study so that when it comes out on the other side, you've had the buy-in, how we've come up with it. And so there shouldn't be any surprises. And I think because of that process at the end, it's pretty rare that you have somebody, say that this wasn't the way it was supposed to go, or I don't believe this, because ultimately they've been part of it the whole way.
Right.
I was thinking about a study we did recently with it was a parenting advice podcast, and they were testing actual topics, and it was pretty cool. Or actual titles. We tested episode titles, and what was interesting was when I looked at the analysis and I looked at all the ones on the left side of the slide that had the most passion and the ones on the right side of the slide that had least amount of passion, there were commonalities. And the commonality is that the ones on the left side, the ones that were the most appealing, were the ones that were about being a good human. They were the ones that were really about teaching your kids to be good people. The ones on the right that weren't as appealing were very situational. It was like chew with your mouth closed and, acting this way in the car. And it was an interesting lesson about, again, how do you make this appealing to the most amount of people within your target audience, right? And it was really cool because I talked to him a week or two ago, one of the guys involved in the study, and he said, we were looking at some of the download data, and it really clearly showed that when we had the topic that was more about being a good person, being a good human, we saw the numbers were better than some of the situational stuff. So it's always nice to see when it gets validated that way too.
It's interesting too because kind of in line with that topic, which you just I remember having discussions with my boys, like what does it take to be a good man? And that conversation, that sit down and, let's have this heart to heart about being responsible and, not getting someone pregnant and all these conversations that happen with, of course you have conversation with girls, but, I remember specifically the deep conversation I had with my sons, and they come back to me all the time and say, that was good advice. I didn't really understand it at the time, but it was good advice because there was this little ding ding that went off in their head. So I think I understand why parents want their kids to be good humans and how that would be a good topic. When you and I met, I don't know, it was a number of years ago. I think we probably met a year before we engaged you for the first time, or maybe 6 months. And when we were, because I think you were at an event, we just talked and you told me what you did. And then when we said we really need to find out what's going on here, I'm like, well, I know this guy, and I didn't fully understand your process.
Yeah.
And we engaged you guys, and you brought us in, and we did the pre work, and then you guys went off did the study, and I'm like, I asked you, how's it going? And you were like, we'll talk to you at the end. There was no secret insights halfway through. You had to go out and collect the data and get that full picture for us. And I was very impatient because I wanted to know, I wanted my hands in the dirt, what's going on.
Yeah.
I want to see the responses for every interview. And that wasn't a good thing because you can get too focused. You need to see the bigger picture. So that's what I really appreciated when we came out the other end. I had actionable results. And that's why today, for those of you listening, that Jay and Coleman Insights is a partner on our partner page because we trust them because we have a relationship and I know the type of work they do. So I understand what podcasters will get. Now, what is the typical cost for a PodPredictor session?
So to A/B test a couple of concepts against each other, it can be as low as $495. So, and that is if you're testing, what was one of the examples we talked about earlier, which is if you're testing it among all podcast consumers, no matter what fan they are of what category, it's pretty simple. We'll test it for $495. If you want to make it a little more custom, and you want to do it among specific category fans, it's a little bit more money, and it's different depending on, some categories are harder to reach than others, obviously. So it depends on the category, but we'll give you a quote on that, but it's not dramatically more. And then, like we talked about earlier, there are other ways to customize PodPredictor. You can, like I said, you could test trailers, you could test show art. There was a variation of PodPredictor that was made public, actually. There's a company called Podcast Radio that did a variation on PodPredictor. And what they were trying to figure out was, so Podcast Radio is based in the UK, and their whole idea was to feature podcasts on radio stations. And so radio stations feature these podcasts throughout the day. And they were launching this in the United States. And so they did a PodPredictor of radio listeners in the U.S. to understand the appeal of podcast radio. And it was pretty interesting. So, again, that was a variation, and it was a different price point,
Sure.
but not dramatic. But it was cool because they were able to test these concepts. And just like some of the deliverables I was telling you earlier, they were really able to understand, okay, well, that concept appeals to these category fans. It appeals to this region of the country, which is really valuable when you have a national product like that, and so on and so forth.
And for those of you listening or watching here, be honest with you, that's a value. It's a real value. I mean, $495, my God. And I think the important part for people to understand here is you're talking to real people.
Right, exactly.
This is the difference. You're not just putting some survey out on a website. You're talking to the listener or prospective listener.
Yeah. I mean, as a research company, we're constantly bringing in panels of high quality consumers. And so we can talk to podcast consumers, talk to radio listeners, we can talk to TV consumers, and so on and so forth, no matter what you're doing. And so that's exactly right. So we can access podcast consumers, and we can do it across the globe. We do a lot of research internationally too. PodPredictor specifically is a US product, but that doesn't mean that we can't do the research, and have done research projects in other places too.
So those with an existing audience, I kind of assume then, like the one show you did episode title testing. Change of album art, changes. What are some scenarios? Change of show name? Does it run the gamut?
It really does. Yeah. I mean, I was talking to someone last week that had a financial services basically feature on YouTube, right, where they're giving tips. And so they were curious about testing like the title slides and testing music that they were playing. So, you can kind of let your mind wander
Hmm.
into lots of different ways, but, we've tested billboards before for radio stations. So yeah, there's all kinds of things you can test. And sometimes one of the neat twists that I think can be really useful for podcasters is we have a tool called Media EKG, and it's a content testing tool. And the way that works is the consumer, and you can do this, by the way, with audio or video, and the consumer has it on their own device, so their tablet, their computer, their phone, and they listen to or watch the content, and second by second, they're rating the content as they like something or don't like something, right?
Oh,
So they're sliding to the left if they don't like it, slide it to the right, right, and it creates this EKG graph that you're showing the peaks and valleys, and then it's identifying, okay, well, what happened in those moments where something dropped out or
right.
something went up. And there are some really cool insights that you can glean from that, because we also look at it just like I was talking about with PodPredictor. It gets segmented into different things. We have a line on the EKG where you'll see a total, but then you can also see, well, gosh, women, it went way down here, right? Or older people, it went way up here, or this category fans. So there's a story that oftentimes emerge from that, where, gosh, we've given advice for, sometimes a show thinks that this one feature they do is terrific, but your audience thinks it's quite misogynistic. Right.
It's really interesting because I remember a number of years ago, I've told this story a lot. I can't say who the client is, but they were seeing like they did about hour show, and about the 45-minute mark, man, their numbers just dropped like a rock.
Yeah.
And they were asking, and how we knew this, because the stat system allows you to see retention. And they're asking me, well, what's happening? And I'm like, well, what's happening at about the 45-minute mark? Because this is where they're,
Right.
within
Right.
about 7 or 8 minutes. And there was two or three things that were happening. It turned out, then they had to do trial and error because they didn't have the EKG.
Yeah.
Trial and error
Right.
by pulling out a segment. And it turned out it was this segment that they did that people were just so, they didn't want to hear it. They left. And
Yeah.
they pulled that segment out, and then their retention numbers went into the high 90s versus in the 70s. And I thought, wow, we're on to something here. But no, the EKG thing really allows you to get this heartbeat across the whole show.
Yes.
I know when people listen to my tech show and their first listeners are like, you talk too long in the beginning. And I'm like, well, that's the way the show's been. The way it's always going to be. Probably I could use an EKG on the show to see how many people leave because of
Yeah.
that are new, and maybe I wouldn't be so hard headed in that regard. But so I guess, in this case, it sounds to me like PodPredictor differs from traditional audience research in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. It does. It does. I mean, there's just, and, for most of the time, Pod Predictor is like I said, it was designed to be affordable for everyone, but there's such a range of things that we can do in
Yeah.
research. It's all about, but what I think, and the thing that I get most excited about with Coleman in podcasting, the work that I do, is that podcasting has, like, if you go back to radio in the 1970s when John Coleman started our company, at that time there wasn't a lot of strategic brand and content research being done in radio. There was a lot of guesswork and a lot of gut, right? And the art and science thing, the blend is real. Like you can't program great podcasts or radio stations on art alone, and you can't program them on science and data alone either,
Right.
because
Right.
then they'll sound boring, right?
Hmm.
You got to find ways to bring it to life. But ultimately, what radio stations learned from our research was how to be more strategic about it, and that it's not just about putting out a great show. It's about, how do I build my brand at the same time? So what
Oh,
we're always talking about, right, is the content that you put out. We have something called a brand content matrix. And ultimately, you have to get to that intersection of strong brand and great content. And that is always thinking about, and this is where I think podcasters, and it's not intentional. A lot of times it's just they don't know,
Hmm.
but it's understanding how to be strategic about every content choice you make, every marketing decision you make. It all has to be in sync with A, what the consumer wants, and B, whether or not it's in sync with your brand. And those two things have to happen. And a lot of times people think about, well, this is great content and that's enough. But is it great content that people expect from your brand that's going to make your brand stronger? Right? And that's the litmus test. And so our research helps you do that. It goes really beyond. Yeah, there's a lot of tools available for podcasters. I often joke about the fact that like the radio rating system is rough. They're based on estimates and they can wobble massively. And at least in podcasting, we've got a lot of measurement that's much more useful than we have in radio, right? But at the same time, it doesn't, those measurements don't necessarily tell you how to grow your brand. They're kind of teaching. A lot of times, I think they're just teaching you to chase the number, chase the number.
Hmm.
But over the long term, the long play is grow the brand, and ultimately, the biggest brands win. They always do.
Recently we had some new hires, and I got a gal that's doing a lot of video editing, shorts, clips, stuff like that. And, we spent a lot of time talking about here is the company, here's who we are and what we believe and what we want to present and who we're talking to. And the first assignment I gave, the product that came back as like, whoa, 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 whoa. I said, we can't present this. Because if someone sees what this is, they're going to go, what is going on over there? And then I explained why, this element, this element, this element. Let's get that out of there. And that individual, super, super creative and wanted to make the product really super fantastic, but it was just a little over where we need to be.
Yep.
So I understand that fine edge of being a little bit snarky, but at the same time, maybe we didn't need this much motion graphic or whatever it was that we were putting into the content. So I get it. I really, really do. Where do you think PodPredictor is going to go in the next few years then?
I think I think that we're going to see it used in a lot of different ways. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some usage on the video side. I wouldn't be surprised if it expands into just some of the different uses that we were talking about that are more customizable. Because trailers, I would love to see more trailer testing. To me, that's a real opportunity because it's a big way that people discover, right?
Mm-hmm.
Understanding, the power of some of the shorts that are being used, whether it be on Reels or TikTok, or,
Right.
and so on and so forth. So that would be my expectation is we'll see some of that. And one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of months actually is there's a lot of interest in PodPredictor on the like the agency side, and I'm talking about like companies that are the full service.
Sure.
We're going to start from scratch, and we help you with all of those things,
Yep.
like all the things you mentioned at the top of the show, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
editing, the SEO,
Right.
the everything, and they look at it and they go, well, we could see ourselves offering PodPredictor as a value to our clients. When a client comes to us and says,
Yep.
hey, I want you to do this. Well, why not pay an extra, $500 to $1,000 in the front before you waste all that time and money and hours and learn up front. So that's my other hope for PodPredictor is that this starts to be adopted as a service among these agencies that are providing value for their clients.
Hey, don't be like Rob and Todd, who were doing a show called the Saturday Morning Tech Show, and then kind of had this realization halfway through, like episode 100, that we're talking about podcasting more than we're talking about tech, and did a name change in the middle of the show. We could have saved ourselves 100 episodes of calling it the wrong thing. So, I probably this would have been invaluable in those early days. So, is there any trends that you're seeing in listener behavior that podcasters should really pay attention more to?
Um,
That's a hard one, maybe.
Yeah, no. Well, it's not. It won't surprise you that a lot of that question is answered with the word video. Um, and but I'll throw a couple of really interesting things at you that we learned in when I was at Podfest a couple of months ago with you. We did a presentation and had some did put out some quick data points. So I'll mention a couple of those now that talk about those trends. But the other thing is that Steve Goldstein and I, Steve from Amplify Media, we did a study back in 2023 at August called "The New Rules of Podcasting on YouTube," and that was the first landmark study that was all about video podcasting. And the funny thing that I love to laugh about now is that at that podcast movement, there was one session dedicated to video podcasting. It was ours. And then, of course, the next year was 15, and now we have tracks. And it's just fascinating in the last couple of years what's happened. We're doing a follow up to that study as a keynote at Evolutions in Chicago. So we'll have a lot of fresh new data. We're going to be trending some of the initial results, but we're also going to be probing a lot of new things as well. And the other thing that's going to be different this time around is we're going to be doing interviews of creators and getting some of their perceptions of podcasting and how they're using social media and how they're using video and marketing and how frustrated are they and and all this kind of thing. So a couple of trends that we're seeing. I mean, number one is the headline has always been that YouTube has become this monster in podcast consumption, which is true. What's really interesting, though, is the percentage of podcast consumers that are now using YouTube as their first preference. That's like the big difference that's happening. We saw that back in 2023, the number of people that were choosing YouTube first for podcasts was 31%. And this year in January, it was 40%. And number two was Spotify at 27 and Apple at 15. So it went from this, almost a tie between YouTube and Spotify that now you have more and more people choosing it as their first preference. And then, one of the other headlines is that is just the way that people define podcasts.
Yeah.
And that in the last 2 years has just taken this monster shift, and all the shift has come among those over the age of 35.
Yeah.
So if you were over 35 a couple of years ago, you were likely to say that a podcast was audio. And what happened at that time, under 35s, they were definitely more likely to say it could be defined as both. What's happened in the last year and a half is if you're over 35, it's been a complete shift that there's now parity. You're as likely to see them interchangeable if you're over the age of 35 as you are under the age of 35.
It's interesting because here's a challenge. We're finding that the majority of podcasters that are trying to do YouTube are finding no success. And, there's going to be a group that's always going to find success. Video is hard. Video is much harder than audio. It's very much unforgiving. And, so what we've done is we've said, okay, if you choose to be video first, that's great. You still can have an audio podcast. And the best part is it's easy because we just put a product together called VidPod where we just pull your stuff out of YouTube, make an audio, publish it for you, and send the metadata downstream. And people can listen or watch. They can make that choice. And I think some of the video folks have actually been surprised by their numbers on audio, and they're not intermixed. You have people that watch, people that listen. And I've kind of known that for years for my own show where 70% listen and 30% watch, and that's been going back since the beginning. But the main difference I have is they watch on a podcast app. They don't necessarily watch on YouTube. So it is kind of this weird dynamic that we kind of knew that from the beginning. Now, why someone would watch me for an hour just talking about tech, it always baffled me, but it's just the way it is. But I think there's still, in today's age, and especially as things are going to be changing with AI, I think people are seeking, the real Todd and the real Jay versus the AI-generated Todd and Jay that's shown with some screen flashes and you can't actually see the talking head. So I think these personal interactions are going to be super, super important going forward. I think creators at all levels, whether they be on YouTube, TikTok, doing audio podcasts or wherever, are going to be sought out more and more, because I don't know about you, but I get on a YouTube video and it's just, you can hear it and it's not a human, it's an AI generated voice. I back out of it immediately because it's just someone's script.
Right.
And they've gained a lot of popularity, though, some of those shows. So there's definitely a business model for people that are doing that. What do you think is the most underutilized growth strategy in podcasting? Because podcasters are always asking me, how do I grow? How do I grow? How do I grow?
Well, probably the most underutilized is using clips in social media for discovery, because you can do that organically. I mean, you can do it paid as well, but going back to the video for just a second, and I agree with everything you said, is to me, it's about being where the consumer is. And there are moments where, well, first of all, as you know, there are plenty of podcasts that do better in audio and are meant better for audio, and there's some that are meant better for video.
Absolutely.
Like I take my friends from Locked On Podcast Network, which is a sports network. And they've now shifted. They were audio first in their consumption, and now it's dominated by video. Now, some of that is the fact that sports translates well on video.
That's right. They can show replays or whatever. Yep.
Yeah. But the other thing is, but when I'm in the car, I'm not consuming video podcasts.
And as more people are going back to work now, they're going to have more time in the car. Yeah.
But it's about giving them that choice, and it's about being where the consumer is. That's what I think the biggest thing is. And so, but with clips, that's just a great way. It's, by the way, one of the things we're going to probe in the study, is because I think one of the big questions is, how much are people seeing these clips and then that's it? Like, are they getting enough satisfaction from it, or is it actually driving consumption to the full podcast? That's something I'm really interested in.
I can tell you, I'll give you my answer.
Yeah.
I watched a clip and I've had enough. I got just enough. And I said, maybe I should go subscribe to their show. And I don't, because they gave me too much on the bone. And I'm like, they gave me too much information. All right. So I got my 3 minutes that I needed, and that's it. And they did a full hour. So I didn't hear sponsor spots. I didn't hear any of that stuff. So at least that's my old guy, rendition of what I feel. And another thing is, it's just like, we for years, we've thrived on audience feedback, and podcast listeners are notoriously bad at giving feedback. You almost got to beg them, or you have to play devil's advocate, or you got to piss them off or something to get feedback. So I think that oftentimes where there is a challenge in podcasting and we have to do better is teaching podcasters how to get feedback. Because the feedback, to be honest with you, it's just like that TikTok. You got that dopamine hit, right? Wow, I love this. Or the guy comes back and says, I hated the show, or whatever it may be. I've said many, many times there was a hater that I miss the hater from my show because it gave me a lot to talk about. So, you're like, I almost want to fake it. Where's the email from the hater? Of course, I would never do that. But at the same time, I think that audience members, I know it's outside the scope of what you guys do, but that feedback is so critical in keeping a podcaster motivated. Thank you. That helped me. And otherwise you feel like if you're just doing an audio podcast, you're talking to the birds, and it can feel that way. But at the same time, I've got a little sticky note right here on my computer screen. It's been here for almost 18 years, maybe 15 years. It says, remember, they're listening.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're doing video, and if you're not descriptive enough, like I did this earlier when you were talking about your EKG, and the listeners are like, they don't even know what I'm doing now, but I'm waving my hand like a wave, right?
Right.
And I didn't describe that, so the listeners didn't get to hear that earlier. So it's almost like we have to make sure that if we're trying to build audiences on both sides of the fence, that we don't forget that those that are listening will get very pissed off and become defranchised from a show if you cannot describe what you're saying, and or you don't put the corresponding link to whatever you were looking at in your show notes. So you say, hey, listen, I know you can't see it, but the link's in the show notes. Go, that's like the number one. Go grab it and look. They'll put up with that. But if you just completely ignore them from the storytelling, you can get in big trouble.
Yeah, that's an important point, and that's something that like sports teams and the play-by-play and color commentary they've gone through, because like every team used to have a TV team and a radio team.
That's right.
And then radio teams, because of the economics, have gotten cut over the years. So a lot of times, yeah, you have like our local team here, the Carolina Hurricanes, you have one broadcast team and they handle TV, and the radio is a simulcast. And you will occasionally hear exactly what you're talking about. They'll say something where they're watching the video, right? But if I'm listening on the radio, I'll have no idea what they're talking about. So you're right. If you're doing that, you got to make sure that it makes sense to the audio consumer. And I want to mention one other thing real quick. When you're talking about discovery and social media and how you, when you see a clip and that's enough for you, right?
Yeah.
And the one thing I'll say about it is that reminds me a lot about like the dopamine fix, the instant gratification that I think is so germane to podcasters is remember though, that it's still a branding opportunity. They might not have gotten you at that moment, but it doesn't mean they won't get you the seventh time that you see the clip.
Problem is they don't tell me where to go find them.
That is a problem. That's a huge problem.
They just assume I know where their thing is.
Yeah, great point.
They just assume. Now, if I'm on YouTube, I can click up and I can, scroll over and hit subscribe. But if I want to listen to the audio podcast, okay, where you live again? What was the name of the show again?
Yeah, you know why? Inside thinking.
Inside thinking. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic, an interesting time that we're in, Jay. I appreciate your insights here. Any other thoughts? Did I miss anything today?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. I appreciate the opportunity to have done this with you today, and it's an exciting year ahead. I'm looking forward to. We're going to be out there a lot this year. We've got the thing coming up at Evolutions. I'm going to be at Podcast Show London for the first time in May.
We'll be there too.
I'm really excited about. Yeah. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Are you exhibiting at London?
We are.
Oh, good. Did you get one of those side booths against the wall, or were you?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I don't remember exactly which booth it is, but it's somewhere along the way.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So we'll be there. But for those of you that are listening or watching, where can they go to find you, and what's a good contact email?
Yeah. So the website for Coleman Insights is Coleman, Coleman, insights.com. And then for me, I'm on the website, but they can email me directly at JAY and then my last name, NACHLIS at ColemanInsights.com.
Did I see also that you had PodPredictor, the domain forwarding over there too? I thought
we do. We
did.
We did go snap up podpredictor.com.
Yeah. So you can also, if you forget Coleman Insights and you remember PodPredictor, we'll have the link in the notes so you can get over there. And of course, they're on the partner page at Blubrry as well. Yeah, very awesome. I'm excited with what you've done here, and it's definitely, I believe, for all of you that are launching a show and or getting ready to revamp or looking to see about engagement, give Jay a call or give him an email and say, hey, how can you help me? It's worth the conversation at a minimum. There's no one else doing what you guys are doing in this regard that I know of. I don't think there's anyone.
I think, I appreciate that. I mean, we're really trying to focus on the brand and content part of this and the strategy of it. And I think that a lot of times, PodPredictor is actually rare in the sense that we don't usually lead with the product. It's usually leading with a conversation to say, what are your questions? What are your challenges? What are your issues? And then let's figure out what it is. And it may be PodPredictor. There have been plenty of conversations, Todd, I've had with somebody about PodPredictor. We end up doing something else for them.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's a better solution, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I would say is, even if you think PodPredictor isn't necessarily for you, and it may be, I guarantee that you've got questions. If you could ask, think about it this way. If you could ask your target audience anything, what would you ask them? and I know you could come up with questions. And the great thing about our type of research is we can find that target audience. Depending how big your podcast is, we can sometimes find your podcast consumer. And so thinking about how to get better and how to grow that brand and how to make your content better by better understanding the target. I mean, that's what this is really all about.
I also think it's important for people to understand that if you do a physical survey, you have to remember that unless you get a big sample, the people that are primarily going to respond are your super fans.
Yes.
And your super fans are not indicative of your greater audience. It's great to know what the super fans are. It'll give you a little bit of an idea. But when you look at the extended audience, the whole picture will change. I guarantee it will. And so don't think that a physical survey of your audience is going to give you what your audience. It'll give you a little bit of insight, but not that much. Whereas when you're talking with somebody and saying, and it may not be someone that's actually subscribed, but if having these concepts and the right questions to answer, it is as if they're listening, and you can find out if you resonate or not. So
yeah, it's like anytime you talk to your people, a lot of times they're going to tell you what you want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that you think you already know, and it's easy to get in your head and go, oh yeah, they love me. It's awesome. They want more of this. Well, they love you because they already love it, right?
Yeah.
They're already there. To grow past that, the problem is your base might be like this. And if you want to grow that base into this,
it's something bigger.
Yeah. Well, you've got to get outside and find out, well, what the larger target audience, what do they want to hear? And guess what? You might find it's not exactly the same as that.
It's kind of funny. I got an email from a fan today, and they said, Todd, this is a little bit political. You may not want to play it on your show. I do a tech show, and we've been talking about everything that's going on in D.C. and everything that's been happening there. And I played it, and it was like, ooh, that's a little, but guess what I'll do? I'll play it anyway, because guess what it does? It generates conversation, and I'm not always right. And it's always good to know the opinion of the audience. So it does give you this realization, maybe I push people one way, but they're definitely thinking another. So, and not always bad. I think that's a good thing. Anyway, Jay, thanks for being on, and much success to PodPredictor.
Thank you, Todd. This was fun. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.